it's my honor to be standing before you. I happen to be the provost that has been the title of the series, the Provost Colloquium series. And I'm not even going to ask, do you know what a provost is? Because I often get a blank stare back. So just to make it easier, provost is another synonym for the chief academic officer at a university. Has a long, rich history that goes way back in time, particularly to the medieval times, and it also had been one time referred to as the jailer. But right now, I am the chief academic officer in that role. Why this is so important to me, this is the second semester of the Provost Colloquium. And it is really thanks to a merry band of faculty that brought this idea to me in the spring, and actually in the fall, late in the fall semester last year, and we initiated it in spring 17. It's been highly successful. We have a series of 6 lectures. The lectures are by invitation to the open community, not only to faculty, even though we want to feature our faculty and the work they're doing in the different fields they represent and disciplines, but we also opened it to adjunct faculty, temporary faculty, alums, and that's why I'm so excited about this event tonight. It is by a featured alum, who, by the way, I had the wonderful opportunity of tagging a few bears with him one March several years ago. So I don't know if that's what turned him on to Antarctica, well, going and seeing bears, black bears in Pennsylvania. But he's quite an unusual young man that you'll be meeting shortly. But the Provost Colloquium, as I said, is a series of 6 by invitation. We even want to encourage members of the community that have maybe a particular expertise or discipline to submit proposals, and we're trying to move in that direction. This commemorates the last of the fall 17 series. We will be moving into the spring series, and I just want to give you a taste of what is. Like I said, it's by competition. We have many applications, and it's reviewed by a group of peers. But next semester, we're going to be hearing about the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance and Peace in Asia with Ko Mishima, who I believe is in political science. Am I right on that, Eugene? Yes. Then we'll have a Kelly McKenzie and Robert McKenzie talking about their summer abroad experience, where they took more than 20 students this past summer to Lund University in Sweden. We'll hear Johan Eliasson, also in political science, talk about trade agreements, the myths, controversy, and how they affect you. We'll hear from Luann Batson Magnuson, Olivia Carducci, Lorraine Closey, and Beth Rajan-Sockman. And if any of you students know them, these are the faculty that do a lot about service learning, either from in math, in speech and language, in sociology, and they'll be talking to you about the benefits of service learning and some of their experiences. We also have a nurse, Bridget Cypress, a newest member on our faculty, who's going to be talking about research, linking findings to the praxis, theory, policy, and evidence-based practice in the health field. We also have John Chang. Many of you might know him in psychology, and he's going to be talking about changing attitudes towards people with disabilities. We also have one special event, which makes it our 7th event, and that's going to be a special DMET, Digital Media, Esports U live gaming event. So really keep your eyes open and your ears open for this event. I'm now going to turn this over to one of the co-chairs. I mentioned to you this was a merry band of faculty that created this Provost series, and it really gives me, first I'll introduce both of them. It's Cem Zenoglu, most recent member of the school board, but also is co-chair, and Eugene Galperin. All right, and you're going to bring a few words, Eugene, or are we going to turn it right on to John? And Eugene also has been a co-chair for the 2nd year in a row, and we really thank you. That's a mathematician, and then of course we have a communication faculty member. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to a dear colleague and a member of the committee, and also one of the earliest people who talked to me, along with Eugene, about a Provost Colloquium, Dr. John Elwood from the physics department. John? You're right there.
Oh, thank you. I'm not sure that's worthy of applause, but thank you all for being here tonight. As Provost Bruno said, my name is John Elwood. I'm a professor of physics here in the university. But tonight I'm here in my other role as a member of the Provost Colloquium Committee. And it's really a pleasure to serve on that committee and to look at all the great proposals, and every once in a while have the opportunity to attend one. And so I'm glad that you are all here tonight to share that. I'm going to say a few words about our speaker tonight, and his resume and pedigree is rather lengthy, so I'm going to refer to my notes here to explain to you what's happening. Okay? So John Weber is our speaker tonight. He's a graduate of East Stroudsburg University with a dual major in computer science and computer security in 2015, and is what some people refer to as a serial entrepreneur. In 2012, Jonathan won first place and $10,000 in the first Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education Student Business Plan competition for his company Identified, a search tool designed for HR and law enforcement professionals. In 2013, he went on to win first place in the Great Valley Regional Business Plan competition and received an award package valued at $100,000 in cash and in-kind services. And he's also well known as the founder of Marathon Studios Enterprises, a company that produces websites that are used by many million people each month. And in 2014, he founded TickCheck, a biotech company dedicated to help combat the spread of tick-borne diseases. And our ESU Northeast Wildlife DNA Labs here does much of the tick testing for TickCheck. And there's a few other interesting facts that you may want to know about John. He was featured in Entrepreneur Magazine in an article on how to make $100,000 while in college. He was also recently on The Walking Dead. And in the past 5 years, he has visited or lived in almost 70 countries on all 7 continents. But tonight, he's here with us. And he's going to talk to us about the 2016-2017 season, in which he spent 4 months, or I guess over 4 months, at the Amundsen South Pole Station in Antarctica. So I would like you all to join me in welcoming John to the fore. Thank you.
All right, so first I just got to make sure that our tech is all working here. Okay, so I'd like to apologize in advance if I cough during this presentation. I have a bit of a cold. I'm not used to it being this warm during November. So my name is Jonathan Weber. I graduated ESU about 2 years ago now. And today I'm going to be talking about 4.5 amazing months that I was fortunate enough to spend in Antarctica last year. So the first question that a lot of people ask me when I tell them that I lived in Antarctica is they ask why. You know, why on earth would you want to go there? So the answer is because it's one of the few places on Earth that still remain where very few human beings have ever set foot, and there remain places, the majority of places in Antarctica, in fact, that nobody has ever set foot before. So the places where I went weren't necessarily places where no one has set foot before. I spent 4.5 months at the Amundsen South Pole Station in Antarctica, which is a research base that's been around and occupied year-round since 1957. But only about 50 years before that, nobody had ever set foot in that place. And in fact, half of the people who first tried to make it there died right after reaching it. So today, the South Pole Station, McMurdo Station, and one other station in Antarctica are managed by the U.S. Antarctic Program. So the U.S. Antarctic Program is it's a government agency underneath the National Science Foundation, and it manages 3 research bases in Antarctica. Palmer Station, which is on the Antarctic Peninsula, McMurdo Station, which is the largest base in Antarctica, and South Pole Station, which is at the South Pole. So the austral summer research season every year is from October through February. So the research season is from October through February because that's the summer in the southern hemisphere, and it's also significantly warmer than it is during the rest of the year. But most importantly, it's because it's light. The South Pole is at the extreme end of the globe, and because of that, over the winter you have 6 months of solid darkness, and then in the summer you have 6 months of solid light. So during the austral summer, there are 2,000 scientists and support staff who work at the 3 major U.S. research bases. So this is a map of Antarctica here. You can see the South Pole is over here, not quite at the center of Antarctica, but fairly close. McMurdo Station is over here, which is the largest U.S. station. Palmer Station is over here. And then scattered around Antarctica, as you can see, are other stations that are manned by scientific research bases from other countries. So Antarctica is a continent that is entirely dedicated to science. There is no military allowed in Antarctica. There are no permanent residents on Antarctica. The only people who live there are people who are working or studying at the scientific bases. So the South Pole Station, as you can see here, is in the middle of the Antarctic Plateau. There are very, very few other bases in the Antarctic Plateau because it is extremely remote, extremely cold, and extremely desolate. Most of the other bases are along the coastline where they're much easier to access and the weather is much more temperate. So how did I get a job with the U.S. Antarctic Program? So a lot of people think from watching all the documentaries that you have to be a scientist, you have to be a physicist or a penguin researcher to get to Antarctica. But the truth is that maintaining research bases in the Antarctic takes a lot of people of all different types, of all different skill sets. So scientists and researchers who are working in Antarctica are there under what's called the Grantee Program. So the U.S. Antarctic Program under the NSF gives them a grant to go down to Antarctica, generally for a short period of time, to conduct their research. So sometimes they might be there for a few days just to install a detector. Sometimes they might be there for months to operate a telescope, but they're only there to conduct their research. The Antarctic Support Contract is who operates and runs the bases. So ASC contractors work for one of 3 main government contracting companies. PAE hires all the blue-collar workers, carpenters, heavy equipment operators, logistics and cargo people. GANEU Services hires food service and janitorial folks, and GHG, the company that I work for, hire communications and IT people. So especially at McMurdo, which is a much larger operation, and also at South Pole and Palmer, you're essentially operating in a small, isolated, sealed-off village from the rest of the world. You need people of every single profession. You need janitors. You need cooks. You need weathermen. You need drivers, you need heavy equipment operators, you need logistics people, and of course you need scientists. So what that means is that it's not just for scientists or researchers to go to Antarctica. Most of you in this room have skill sets or have experience that would be useful on one of those Antarctic bases. So when I decided I want to go to Antarctica, which was kind of randomly while I was on a plane back from England, I watched a documentary about penguins and I decided, hey, that's the last continent I haven't been to. What's it going to take to get me there? I applied for every job that was open. I applied to work in the kitchen, which was, you know, I've worked in kitchens before. I applied to work in IT and communications. I applied to work in logistics. I actually got 2 job offers. I got one job offer to work in the kitchen and the other job offer to run the communications and computer systems at the South Pole Station. So you can guess which one I took. Now, getting hired is just the start. There is a huge gauntlet of qualifications that you have to go through once you get a job offer before you can actually get in a plane to Antarctica. So first, the medical qualifications, especially if you're at South Pole. You will be at one of the most remote places on Earth, and there will go days and even weeks, and during the winter, months, 8 months in total, that you will have 0 contact with the outside world. No planes come in, no planes go out. That means that if you have a medical emergency and it can't be treated there, you likely will die. and there have been cases in the past that some of you guys have probably heard of, where a scientist at the South Pole Station found out she had breast cancer during the winter, and she actually had to operate on herself with supplies that were airdropped in. So, of course, the Antarctic program wants to prevent this from happening. So you have to go through a very stringent medical examination before you go down. So you have to be medically cleared. You have to go through a whole range of tests. I had to have my wisdom teeth removed, even though there wasn't any issue. They all had to go just in case something happened. And up until 3 years ago, they made you take out your appendix to prevent appendicitis. There's also a long list of required immunizations. And it's not because there are strange bacteria in the Antarctic. It's because if you bring in a virus or some bacteria from the outside world, you're living basically in a spaceship, a sealed pod with 50 or 100 other people, and you will infect all of them, which could threaten the safety of the base. Psychological qualifications. You also have to go through stringent psych evaluations, especially if you're wintering over. Drugs and alcohol are prohibited. And the psychological test they put you through is very odd. It was developed in the 50s and the 60s, and they ask you questions like, which of the two would you prefer, to build a birdhouse or to spend a day picking flowers in a field? And they somehow use this to determine whether or not you are going to be someone who's going to thrive and survive in a very, very isolated, very, very harsh condition. And finally, you have to go through extensive training. So the winter rovers especially get trained in firefighting, medical work, emergency response, because when you're down there, there is no 911. You are 911. So if anything happens, it's only up to you and your colleagues on the base to make sure that it's taken care of. So once you get through all that, then comes deployment. So for me, that involved 6 hours from New York to Los Angeles, 16 hours from Los Angeles to Auckland, New Zealand, another hour to Christchurch, where after a couple days of delays because of weather in Antarctica, we took a military C-17 jet from Christchurch Airport to McMurdo Station in Antarctica, where we landed on the ice, waited in McMurdo, where I was stuck for almost 2 weeks because of weather in the South Pole. And then finally we were able to take a ski-equipped LC-130 transport from McMurdo Station to the South Pole Station, which takes another 7 hours. So grand total, that's over 36 hours in the air. And if you combine all the waiting, it took several weeks plus to get from here to the South Pole. So what do you wear when you're in Antarctica? Temperatures go down very, very, very low. And first question that I have, I'm going to have a couple questions throughout this, and anybody who answers correctly is going to get, at the end of this, an Antarctic Program patch. So who can guess here how cold it gets during winter in Antarctica? Who's got a guess? Yeah, in the back?
Negative 50.
Negative 50. You got another guess? Yeah?
Minus 80.
Another guess?
Minus 60.
So the correct answer is, in the winter, it gets minus 100 and below. So after the presentation coming up, and you'll get a patch. Now, that is very, very cold. That is colder than the surface of Mars during the day. Now, when I was flying down there, it wasn't minus 100. When I landed at the South Pole, it was 60 below zero. But that's still pretty damn cold. So this is a photo from the Clothing Distribution Center in Christchurch, where they issue Antarctic Program gear to you before you get in your plane to the South Pole. So they have requirements that when you are on that plane, you have to be wearing full kit. So they issue you goggles, a balaclava or a knit hat, mittens or gloves, wind pants or insulated Carhartt overalls, and really, really heavy military boots, as well as the famous red parka. So this parka that I'm wearing, it's called Big Red. It's a Canada Goose brand parka, and Canada Goose, I'm sure many of you guys are aware of, is now a famous luxury parka manufacturer. But 25 years ago, when they started making parkas for the Antarctic Program, they weren't very well known. They became famous by making these parkas like the one that I'm wearing to issue to scientists down in Antarctica. You know, they've been featured in movies, they've been featured in documentaries. So now, Canada Goose ripped off the Antarctic Program's logo and they sell it on their luxury parkas. So the reason that I have this parka, they don't let you keep them, is because, you know, I am an entrepreneur. I'm always looking for business opportunities, and after I came back from the South Pole, I bought 750 pounds of surplus parkas from the Antarctic program, refurbished them, and just started selling them. We just sold out our last one yesterday, and interestingly enough, I was actually able to sell these for more than the Antarctic program initially bought them for. And this parka that I'm wearing is 20 years old. So that's just a little aside. Even though I'm going down to Antarctica, I'm not going to stop looking for business opportunities. So this was my kit that I was issued down in Antarctica. These are Carhartt boots, the big red parka, the goggles. They give you 2 giant bags to put it in. And after we were issued all that gear, we actually had 2 or 3 false starts where we woke up at 5 a.m. They told us to get ready to get in the plane. And then we got the call, nope, never mind, it was canceled. Too windy in Antarctica. But finally the day came that we went to the clothing distribution center. We all geared up, and we all loaded into a military C-17 jet. So this is a C-17 Globemaster, the largest military transport plane, and there are 2 of them that they fly back and forth to Antarctica during the summer, and they can only land it at the beginning and the end of the summer because this plane is so heavy that the ice has to be extremely thick in Antarctica to land there. So this is the only military presence in Antarctica, is the Air Force and the Air National Guard, who fly everybody around there. And these planes are what bring in all of the food, all of the supplies, and all the personnel for the Antarctic program. So it was amazing to be able to look out the window and see the first glimpse of the sea starting to turn to ice, to see the first rocky, snowy islands, and then finally to start flying over the frozen mountains of the Antarctic mainland. And then the plane landed at Erebus Field in McMurdo Station, Antarctica. So this is Ivan the Terra bus. It's a giant air wheel bus that they use to drive you back and forth from the station to the airfield, which is about 5 kilometers away. So we landed as one of the first C-17 flights coming in for the summer. So we had a full plane full of personnel, mostly going to McMurdo Station, but also myself and about 45 other people who were the first batch of people going to be flying into the South Pole to relieve the winter overs from the previous season. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about McMurdo Station, which is the largest scientific base in Antarctica. There are 1,000 people who are living and working there at any given time during the summer. And McMurdo Base is one of the places that you most commonly see when you're seeing documentaries about Antarctica, when you're seeing the planet Earth like nature documentaries. You have seals there. You have penguins, you have all the Antarctic wildlife that you're used to seeing, and it's also the easiest place to get to. So McMurdo Station is on an island. It's on an island called Ross Island that's just off the Antarctic mainland. One of the only known active volcanoes in Antarctica is right smack in the middle of it. And as you can see here, McMurdo Base is big, it's sprawling, and it looks kind of like a mining town. Like a mining town in Alaska or some other company town. So you can see there's these tanks over here for fuel over in the middle. Most of those buildings that you see over there are dormitories or living areas. And then all scattered out around the exterior are laboratories, storage buildings, and all the other facilities that you need to keep 1,000 people alive year-round on the coast of Antarctica. So that's Mount Erebus. Back there you can see some smoke wisping out from the top. Mount Erebus has erupted several times, but it hasn't threatened the base yet. And one of the reasons that the base is there is because geologists like studying Mount Erebus and the effects of Mount Erebus and the surrounding geology on Antarctica. This is the McMurdo cafeteria. It's very similar to a university cafeteria here. You have a lot of tables. You have a big buffet where you can go in. They have 3 hearty meals that are served breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And when we were there, it was kind of cliquey, you know, kind of like college or high school. So all of us South Pole people sat together. All the McMurdo people had their little clumps. And then you had the people in McMurdo who all knew each other. You know, some of them had been there all winter, so they were all sitting together. They had all these in-jokes, and here we are, you know, the South Pole people, you know, just kind of passing through. They also have 3 bars at McMurdo. They have one bar called Southern Exposure, one bar called Southern Lights, and then they have a coffee house that serves wine. All the bartenders and et cetera, they're volunteers from among the workers and the scientists. This was the Halloween party. We weren't initially supposed to be there for Halloween, but we were. So people go and they find bits and pieces of whatever they can and then put together costumes. This is one of the bars with our South Pole group getting drunk before we were supposed to go to the South Pole. This is the skua shack. So a skua is a bird, you know, that's kind of a scavenger in Antarctica. So all of the Antarctic bases have what they call a skua shack, where basically stuff that you don't need anymore, you just put it there, and then it's free property for anybody who needs to go and get it. So it's looking kind of stripped down right now because this was the day after Halloween, and everybody had gone in there and grabbed whatever they could find to make costumes. This is one of the dormitories. Again, you know, these are very Spartan accommodations. You're going to have 4 people to a room, and you know, the people, we were only there for, you know, it was supposed to be a couple days. We were there for a couple weeks, so it was for South Polies in there. But the folks who stay there year-round, they'll put up little, you know, like cloth barriers so they have their own personal space. They'll customize their area, hang up some posters. Very similar to a dorm. So over here, I actually did get the chance to experience some Antarctic life while I was in McMurdo, which is something that you won't get to see at the South Pole for reasons that I'll show you guys later. So this right here is a tank where they have some of the little creatures that they've brought up from the seabed in the ocean right outside McMurdo Station. So this little guy is actually called an isopod. Looks like a giant louse, a giant sea louse. And then you also have, you know, like your sea anemones, sea stars, other things that you'd expect to see on the seafloor. This is the isopod here. You also have giant sea spiders. Now, the interesting thing about Antarctic life is that we have this thing called Antarctic gigantism. These sea spiders live at the very bottom of the ocean in many, many places around the world. But generally, they only get about this big. In Antarctica, they get this big. So we still don't know entirely why they get that big. We think it has something to do with the coldness of the water, slowing down their metabolism, allowing things to live much longer and get much bigger. But these spiders, they don't know how long they live. They don't know how big they get, and they barely even know what they eat. So they have these things in these tanks, you know, and they're just studying them for the whole season, trying to learn more.
And it was a really small species, and it lived 9 years.
They're really creepy. So this is the observation tube that I also got the chance to go down. They have like what's kind of like a little diving bell. So what I'm on right there is sea ice, and it's 6 feet thick. So they have this little diving bell that they put down below there so scientists can go down and watch the undersea life. And this is a bad picture, but that's one of the little transparent fish that live under the water, and that water is below freezing. So the fish actually has antifreeze in its blood that prevent it from freezing solid. So another cool thing that I got to see while I was at McMurdo was some of the remnants of Antarctica's first explorers. So specifically the Discovery Hut, which was the home base for Scott's expedition to the South Pole back in 1911. So you can see right up here in the foreground that little wooden hut. And that hut is Discovery Hut, which was built in 1910 by Captain Scott and his crew. They sailed in from England, and they were attempting to become the first people to reach the geographic South Pole. So they stayed over here over the winter, They lived in that hut for about 2 years while they were preparing for their expedition, and then they made their run to the South Pole. So this hut has been here since 1911, and it's been virtually untouched. So when you go inside, one of the first things that you pass is a mummified seal body outside the door that's been there since 1911. And again, Antarctica is freezing cold. This has been mummified, desiccated, and there's no predators to eat it. So it's still there. Inside, you can still see the supplies in the boxes that they left behind when they left this hut. You can even see hardtack crackers that they left sitting out on a shelf, possibly still edible, but I didn't try. So this is the hut that the 6 men lived in. So Scott and his men left from McMurdo in 1911, and they attempted to reach the geographic South Pole overland, initially with sled dogs and later on foot. They were racing against Roald Amundsen, who was a Norwegian explorer, and they were racing to become the first humans to make it to the geographic South Pole. Now, Amundsen had a lot of experience with polar travel. He had attempted to reach the North Pole before. Scott was, a very respected adventurer, but he made some critical mistakes. They killed their dogs about halfway through. They tried to use some new technology, newfangled like steam equipment to move their stuff over land. And they made it to the South Pole. Amundsen made it to the South Pole in December of 1911. Scott made it in January of 1912, 1 month after Amundsen, where he found a tent, a Norwegian flag, and a bottle of schnapps that Amundsen had left him to show that he had been there first. And Scott and his men all died on the way back from the South Pole, only a couple hundred miles from this hut here. They were so close to surviving, but they had used so much energy trying to haul their equipment over land that nobody survived. So the next day, I made that same trip, but I made it in a much more comfortable and much more survivable way, flying on an LC-130. But of course, that doesn't come without its own issues. We had flights canceled constantly. I think we must have had 5 or 6 times when the flight was canceled, and we just came back to McMurdo. So we would drive in one of these giant snow vehicles, again, back to the airfield. We would all load up on the C-130, everybody's all kitted up, everybody's excited to get out of McMurdo. Everybody snaps in, loads their stuff, we're all ready to go. This time we even started moving, they started the propellers, we started taxiing around, but then the pilot just came out of the cockpit, looked at us, shook his head, and then we just drove back, got off, got back on the van, and then went back to McMurdo. But after 3 or 4 times, we came back, we got in the plane, and it actually took off. And then, about 6 hours later, we were at the South Pole, the southernmost, coldest, most remote place on Earth. So we were the first plane. We were the first LC-130 to land at the South Pole. We landed, I think it was November 2nd or 3rd of last year. And when we landed there, we were the first people that the winter rovers had seen since the last plane left the year before. So we didn't really know what to expect. I didn't know what to expect. But they were all there waiting for us. They were all there, waving and cheering when the plane landed. They brought us all inside, showed us around. And then, of course, the first thing that I did was go out to the South Pole, to actually, say, I've been at the South Pole. This isn't the South Pole. This is the fake South Pole. This is the ceremonial South Pole. So this one, they always keep it right smack in front of the station. You can see the station reflected behind me. And the flags of all the nations that signed the Antarctic Treaty are in front of it. But the real South Pole is a bit over to the side, right here. So the reason the geographic South Pole is all the way over here instead of nice and pretty in the middle of the station is that it moves. And I'll explain a little bit later why it moves, but they have to change it every single station, or every single year the station changes it. So the geographic South Pole, it has quotes from Amundsen and Scott there. So Amundsen quote, remember he was the first, on December 14th, 1911, said, "So we arrived and were able to plant our flag at the geographic South Pole." Now Scott's quote says, "The pole, yes, but under very different circumstances from those expected." He was kind of depressed at the time because he had just realized he had lost his competition with Amundsen. And the way we found that, you might remember, he died. You know, how do we know what he said? Because he wrote it down in his diary, and they found his diary in his pocket when they finally found his body 2 years later. But what they don't put on the South Pole sign is the line that came after that in his diary. And it says, "This is a god-awful place." And when I first got there, it was 60 degrees below zero, and it was biting, biting cold. So those gloves that I'm wearing in this picture, I actually didn't realize weren't the kind of gloves that I was supposed to be issued to go to the South Pole. They weren't thick enough, and a couple days later, when I was out skiing to one of the stations, kind of on the outskirts of the South Pole area, I got frostbite in the tips of my fingers. And luckily, I was able to get back inside really quickly, but I couldn't feel the tips of my fingers for weeks. Now, that was the only time that that happened. The gear that they give you, as long as they give you the right gear, is fantastic. It's top notch. And when I was out there, you know, I was never really cold. You get used to it. You get used to it probably after a couple weeks, and you slowly adapt to the point where you don't really notice it. Later in the season, when it was minus 20, minus 10, the warmest it got was 6 degrees below zero. You know, we thought it was, you know, warm. It was toasty. We would go out. We wouldn't wear these big jackets. You know, they were too heavy. We'd sweat. So this is the actual South Pole, geographic South Pole marker. So when you are standing there, you are standing in every single time zone. You are the southernmost person on Earth. And you're also standing on every single latitude. So the latitude of every single place in the world. You can have, you know, 1 foot on, you know, one latitude and 1 foot on the complete opposite one. It's really, you know, it's really a cool feeling. It's an amazing place to be. So now let's do a little tour of the South Pole Station. So the South Pole Station, the way we like to talk about it, it's almost like it's a spaceship. It's the closest thing that we really have to, you know, a spaceship or a habitat on a foreign planet. And NASA actually does a lot of studies at the South Pole Station preparing us for a future moon base or a Mars base, including one study they were doing this winter. So this is the South Pole Station's main entrance. So one of the first things that you're going to notice is that it's on stilts. So it's on stilts because at the South Pole you have drifting snow. It doesn't really snow. The South Pole is a desert. It's the driest, highest desert in the world. You wouldn't necessarily think that just from seeing it, but it is. There's only about this much precipitation, actual precipitation every year. But you have what's called katabatic winds that are coming in over the polar plateau, blowing snow and blowing crystallized ice that build up underneath the station. This is not the first South Pole Station. The first South Pole Station was built in 1957 by the Navy Seabees. By the 1970s, it was completely buried by this drifting snow. They abandoned it. They built a new South Pole Station, a geodetic dome. By the 90s, that got buried. So then, when they built the third South Pole Station, the Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station, they decided to learn something from those last two incidents, and they put it on stilts that can actually be jacked up. So they do go around with bulldozers and shovels and dig it out as much as they can. But in the event that the snow gets too high, which they expect it will over the next few years, they're going to be able to jack up the station, and they can do that several times, which is really going to extend the life of this station. But it won't last forever. Eventually, you know, it will get buried, and they're going to have to rebuild it. So this is the inside of the main hallway of the station. The station is one single giant building. So if you take the station and the underground tunnels, It's combined a total of 60,000 square feet. So you have this main building here that has all of the scientific areas, the galley, and then you have wings that go out to the back. Those are the living quarters. And then you have down that hallway, through those doors, you go down what's called the beer can, which is a set of exactly 92 steps that goes down about 20 feet below the surface of the ground to the utility tunnels. So hanging on the wall along the station are photos of every single winter-over crew that has spent time at the South Pole, that spent a winter at the South Pole since 1957. So these guys here were the first winter-over crew. You can see they had a dog with them. That's not allowed anymore because of the Antarctic Treaty. This over here is 1958, the second guys. So over here, this is the rec room. It was called the B2 Lounge. This was in the wing that I lived in, and this was kind of the hangout area. So this was, you know, after a long, cold day of working outside, you know, you could hang out here, drink a beer. They did have beer that you could buy. It was actually cheaper than beer here because there's no taxes in Antarctica. But the government spent a lot of money. They spent a lot of money to bring that beer in. And one of my jobs was to run the hoist, to bring the alcohol rations into station. We would go through about 1,000 pounds of it every 2 weeks. So this station over here, this little area, is what's called B2 pod. This was actually the area that I lived in, and it's built to serve as a life raft, an emergency escape pod in the event of, you know, the station blowing up or catching on fire. So you can see there's a giant freezer door over there on the side. So in the event that the rest of the station loses power or something really, really bad happens, everybody could come in here, seal off the door. There's an emergency kitchen. There's an emergency generator. So the South Pole has, you know, multiple levels of redundancy because it is extremely remote. And luckily, there have been no major catastrophes there. And one of the reasons because of that is because of the level of planning that they put into building this station. This over here looks a little bit out of place at the South Pole. And it is, because this is our hydroponic greenhouse. So there's a hydroponic greenhouse that can supply about 30 pounds of vegetables per week at the South Pole. It's completely run by volunteers who are coming in every single day to check the settings, to start new things, to harvest. And this is one of our only sources of fresh food down there. Now during the summer months when I was there, every couple weeks we would get a delivery of freshies, which is fruit, non-frozen or dried food that's flown in from New Zealand. But this, during the winter, is the only source of fresh food. And they are very, very thankful for it. This is the South Pole Galley. So you can see, it's similar to McMurdo, just much smaller scale. South Pole Station has, at max, 140 people who can live and work there. And at most parts of the season, it's at under that maximum capacity. So you have about 70, 75 people who are the core staff and the core scientists. Those are the guys who are there for the full season. The rest of them are grantees or contractors who are coming in for a couple days to a couple weeks to do a project and then leave. So with those 75 people, of them, about 40 stay there the entire year. Those are guys who flew in with me and who stayed there after I left. And the last one of them actually just got out from the South Pole 2 days ago. He just landed in New Zealand. And actually that's him right there on the left. His hair grew really, really long. They don't have any barbers or anything down there. So if you're going to get a haircut, you just have your friend do it. It doesn't really look that great. But then again, who are you trying to impress? Some guys, when the last plane takes off, they do like a reverse mohawk, or they do something crazy just so that they know, it's all going to be back to normal by the time they leave. So this is the food line here. The food at the South Pole was actually really, really good. We had a really, really talented chef. Even though he had limited stuff to work with, a lot of it was dried, he did a damn good job with it. I don't think I've enjoyed eating food this much for a long time. And you eat a lot when you're down there. This is our freshies delivery. So this is about as much as we'd get for the entire station. And as soon as everybody heard that freshies were there, everybody would make a mad dash to the cafeteria to try to grab as much as they could before everybody else came in. So luckily, the chef was a friend of the head of my department. We would help him out by like running the hoist to, bring up the fresh food. So he would always give us first pick. So, we could skim a little off the top before everybody else showed up. This down here is at the bottom of the beer can leading into the utility tunnels. So the utility tunnels go on for miles. The main utility tunnels are used for storage. They're used for the power plant and other utility type functions. And then there's others that they use for various construction or research purposes. This over here is the South Pole Power Plant. So the power plant has 4 redundant generators, and then of course there's a fully separate power plant in the event something happens to this one. There's only one running at any given time, but they keep a hot backup running, and then the other 2 they keep in constant readiness in the event that something happens. This power plant is what keeps the station alive. It's the waste heat from this power plant that actually keeps everybody warm. So if anything were to happen and this power were to be lost, the station would not be able to survive for very long. So this is one of the most important places and one of the most important jobs in the station. This is the logistics arch. So you can see here they're storing a lot of the dry food, a lot of the supplies that they need. They need to store everything that's needed for a full year because after the last plane leaves for the winter, there's going to be no resupply for 8 months. And even before that, weather can cause resupply to be delayed for weeks. So we always need to have everything on hand that we could possibly need. And this isn't all of it. There's actually a lot more that's buried outside under the ice. So this out here is when you exit the tunnels. You can see the logistic arches back there. And this area behind the station, you don't usually see this in pictures. It's what's called the Berms. So there's a lot of utility buildings, and then there's areas where supplies would be buried or piled up on top of the snow. It's not very pretty, but this is one of the areas where most of the work is going on to keep the station running. So you can see in the front there are little logistics buildings where they deal with supplies and shipping and refueling the planes. Out behind that you can see the snow mounds where there's all sorts of stuff like science equipment, food buried, and then all the way in the back you can see the communications buildings. And then you can see over on the right an LC-130 that was just coming into land. So this is the Berms. So stuff here, gets buried and then it just disappears. We really have no idea how much stuff there is in here because they've been burying stuff really since the 50s. So once a year, everybody in every single department goes out, gets into heavy equipment, grabs shovels, and they go and they try to dig up a berm, find out what's there, store what's needed, and then get rid of the rest of it. So right here, this box that we had just dug up has parts from some kind of science project back in 1991. Nobody knows whose it was, nobody knows what it is, so they're just sending it back to the States to be disposed of. Over here, this is the satellite dome. So one of the things that I was responsible for was going out and debugging issues that happened with this dome and with the other communications equipment. At the South Pole, we only had internet for anywhere from 4 to 12 hours a day. So we had internet from 3 satellites. 2 of them were ex-military satellites, and one of them is the same satellite that gives internet service to the International Space Station. And that was the only satellite that was worth anything. You could actually see images, go on Facebook. The other ones you could barely even, send a text chat. But every once in a while, the space station would be doing some kind of upgrade, so their bandwidth would be prioritized, and they'd just radio us and say, "Yeah, well, too bad, guys, you're not getting internet today." So we were responsible for sending a lot of the scientific data that's collected out using this limited internet connection, and we were also responsible for making sure that everybody on the station, while they got internet, they didn't use too much to threaten the science and the logistics purposes that communications needed to serve. So I remember when the election happened last year, we were currently in the dark zone. We had no internet. So we actually found out who won by using a ham radio, and everybody was gathered around the ham radio, and we just called out, "Hello, hello, is there anybody out there? This is the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station." We got some guy in an island off the coast of Africa, and we asked him if he had an internet connection, and we asked him to tell us the status of the election. So that's how we found out. So this is my berth here. This is where I lived for 4.5 months. Unlike McMurdo, everybody at the South Pole Station gets single berths. And really the reason for this is because they know that you are going through a lot. You're packed into a little box with a lot of other people. You can't really go outside during the winter. You need to have some place that's yours. You need to have some place where you can go back and relax. So this was that place. So it's not big. It's barely enough room for a tiny little desk and a bed, but it served the purpose. And it was from that desk over there that I was continuing to run my companies back here from the South Pole for the 4.5 months that I was down there. So the South Pole Traverse is a really, really interesting subject. You remember back when I was talking about the power plants. The South Pole uses a lot of fuel. It uses 60 gallons of jet fuel a minute. They burn JP8 jet fuel that's mixed with antifreeze to prevent it from freezing solid. So how do you bring that much fuel to keep the station alive for an entire year to one of the most remote places on Earth? So the answer is the South Pole Traverse. So a lot of fuel is brought in by the LC-130s. They'll fill up their fuel tanks, and then once they land, they're going to offload some of that fuel and store it in our storage tanks. But that costs a lot of money. And of course, this being the National Science Foundation, their budget isn't huge. So the solution that they came up with, and they've been doing this for about 8 years now, is that they take a bunch of really hard, badass guys, they put them all in trucks, and then they drag bladders with over 100,000 gallons of fuel from McMurdo Station, 800 miles across the glaciers, across the ice, onto the Antarctic Plateau, all the way to the South Pole Station. So I went out and I skied out to meet the first traverse that came in. This is their living quarters. So you have a tractor over here that's pulling the thing in the back. That's like their little mechanics room. And then the thing in the front is the place where the 8 guys who drive these tractors live, cook, and sleep for the 30 days that it takes them to get from McMurdo to South Pole. So this over here is one of the tractors pulling the fuel bladders coming in. So each one of these, I believe, can bring something like 12,000 gallons of jet fuel. And when they're hauling this stuff, the first traverse that goes over, they have to have ground-penetrating radar to make sure that none of these machines fall into crevasses. When they find a crevasse, they drop down a stick of dynamite, blow it up, collapse it, and then drive over it. So when these guys get in, they've got long beards, covered with ice. The moment they come in, like they call out over the station intercom, South Pole Traverse spotted on horizon, everybody come to the galley before they come in and eat it all. So you talk about ice road truckers and all these other Discovery Channel things. They have nothing on these guys. I have no idea why they haven't gotten a TV show yet. So now, what did I actually do when I was down there? So my title was the Senior Computer Technician. The IT department at the South Pole was just 4 guys. So it was me, a sysadmin, a comms guy, and a satellite guy. So my job was basically to be the generalist that went around and made sure that all of the various different computer stuff and communication stuff kept working. So this is me standing on top of an outbuilding here. We had just installed this directional antenna. It's about 5 kilometers from the station at a site that they were doing ice core drilling to transmit the data back to the station. This is a little display that I built to show in the galley the current temperature. I hooked up one of the outside station webcams so that you could see what was going on out there. I was really proud of this. Over here, I actually had 2 jobs while I was down there, because for the first month and a half, we had no communications guy. The one guy who was supposed to come down had failed his medical exam, and if the medical guys don't physically qualify you, you're not going down. So you just have to make do. So the station manager said, "Hey John, can you learn how to do this?" And I was like, "All right, I've never really worked with hardware before, but you have to learn." The satellite guy taught me some stuff. I read some books. I went on the internet when I could, and I had to learn how to repair land mobile radios that got run over by tractors. It was actually a lot of fun. So this is one of the station webcams that's pointing out at some of the telescopes over in the distance. So you guys can actually see these webcams. If you go to usap.gov, you can just go to Google and type in Antarctic Program South Pole Station webcam, and you'll see the webcam that I installed. I don't know if the internet is currently up right now. If it's not, you'll see that there's no connection, but otherwise you can see a low quality because of the bandwidth, but nonetheless a live stream of what's happening down there. And this is me running a shift in the power plant. So the thing about the South Pole is that when you have such a small group of people who have to keep this together, everybody has to multitask. Everybody has to generalize. Now, in the real world, I don't think anybody would ever trust me to run a power plant. I wouldn't trust me to run a power plant. But down here, you have two power plant guys, who take turns doing 12-hour shifts. They never get any time off. So, they ask for volunteers. Hey, come down. We'll show you how to go and check all the valves and, check the temperatures of all the fuel and the fuel levels. And if anything seems like it's going to explode, just call me in this radio here. And so, I went and learned how to operate a power plant. On top of that, I got to be trained in a lot of medical, emergency medical stuff. So at the beginning of this, they said, hey, who has medical experience? I raised my hand and said, well, I had first aid merit badge in Boy Scouts, and the doctor was like, all right, that's good enough, you're with us. So they took 5 or 6 of us, and through the entire season, they were training us basically how to be a medical assistant or a nurse. So at the South Pole, you have a doctor and you have a physician's assistant, and they are responsible for dealing with any medical issues that may happen, minor ones or major ones. Doctors are used to working with a staff of dozens of people in a modern emergency room, but down at the South Pole, you're all they have. So they took us, and everybody, got trained with a specialty. So they had some guys who they trained to basically be the EMTs who would go out, if somebody broke a leg or, hurt themselves, go out, find them, secure them, load them up, bring them back. And I was trained to work back in the clinic. So while the guys were out, I was the radio dispatcher. And then when they came back, I was basically trained to be the nurse. So I was taught how to do x-rays. I was taught how to do EKGs. I was taught how to take blood. I was taught how to do intravenous injections. This is us over here being trained how to do IV injections. And it didn't turn out so well the first time. This guy wound up losing a lot of blood in the floor, but he was good-natured about it. So I actually wound up having to use this several times. We actually had a much more eventful season this year than there have been in past seasons. So the first incident that happened is I was at lunch, and the doctor came back, and he was like, hey, John, come quick, I need you. And we went in, so there was a fire tech who had been brought up from McMurdo to upgrade the South Pole's fire alarm system. Now, he was a bit of an overweight guy, and he had gotten a special clearance to come up to South Pole because they really needed his skill set. So, unfortunately, when he came here, he was not able to adapt to the altitude or to the environment. So the South Pole is at 10,000 feet. Even though it is, very, very flat, very, very featureless, you're pretty high up. The air is very thin and the air is very cold. And he went straight from sea level up to 10,000 feet. And he wound up having a pulmonary embolism. So they had me working with them to stabilize this guy. They put him in a hyperbaric chamber. And luckily, we had a plane that was scheduled to come in about an hour later. So we were able to get him on it and then fly him back to McMurdo, where he was able to be evacuated to New Zealand and recover. A couple weeks later, in another altitude-related incident, we had a scientist who was in to work on one of the telescopes. He came up, and he was feeling a bit woozy. When he was outside getting trained on how to use a snowmobile, he blacked out briefly, flipped himself over the handlebars, and got run over. So, we were really worried about that, but luckily, he just wound up having a minor fracture. And again, we were able to stabilize him and then get him evacuated. There was also one other incident, a higher profile incident that you guys might have heard about that I'll talk about a little later. That happened from a medical perspective. But first, let's talk a little bit about science in Antarctica. So science is the reason, that we have been at the South Pole since 1957. The science that comes out of Antarctica, even though it's a tiny, tiny portion, of all the funding that goes into science nationwide, it generates an outsized amount of data. There are a lot of different scientific experiments that you cannot do anywhere else in the world. There's a lot of data that you can't get anywhere else in the world. And one of those is ice coring. So ice coring allows you to generate a climatological record going back thousands of years by testing tiny little air bubbles that are frozen into the ice. So the South Pole is at 10,000 feet, not because it's on a mountain, because it's sitting on 2 miles of solid ice that go down to the bedrock that have built up a tiny, tiny little bit every single year. So when you drill down to the bedrock, you're getting ice from 40,000 years ago. As an aside, they actually get our water from melted ice, and the area where they're melting water right now is about 2,000 years old. So they call it Jesus water because, the ice coring also, to celebrate when they get a new hole, they'll take a little piece of ice core and then they'll make it into ice cubes so you can drink it with some whiskey. 40,000-year-old ice cubes. So this ice coring project, the South Pole Ice Core Project that they called Spice Core, was actually able to get a full 40,000-year record of climatological data that they can use to check historical levels of greenhouse gas. They can find information about historical volcanic eruptions because there will actually be a layer of ash frozen into the ice. And a lot of the information that we have about historical climatology comes from here, from 2 miles underneath the Antarctic ice sheet. This is their ice coring camp that's out about 5 kilometers from the South Pole. This is working on another observatory that was a sun observatory. So one of the interesting things about the South Pole, and the reason that there's so many observatories and telescopes down there, is, well, you know what? Let's see. Can anybody guess for another patch? Why would people come to the South Pole to set up an observatory? Yeah.
No light pollution.
That's one. You get a patch. Who's got another idea?
To study the effects of water from like 40,000 years ago, how it changed.
So that's not for telescopes and astrophysics.
The Earth's not moving as much?
Absolutely. So that is a big one. So 2 patches here. So the Earth is not moving. So think about it here. We have a day-night cycle. The Earth is rotating. We have an observatory here at ESU. So let's say that you wanted to study a star. How long could you point your telescope at that star? Probably no more than about 5 or 6 hours before the Earth rotates, and then the star is no longer somewhere where you can point your telescope at it. It's now below the horizon. At the South Pole, the Earth is spinning around a spot in the sky directly above you. So if there's an area of the sky that you want to study, you can point your telescope at it, and then you can keep your telescope pointed at it for 6 months. So this is one of the critical areas that makes a lot of this astrophysics and a lot of this astronomy possible. So going back briefly to climatological data, NOAA also has an observatory here where they're testing the current air. So they're testing the levels of pollutants and greenhouse gases in the air. So Antarctica is at the center of what's called the polar vortex. So there is, a giant circle of air that keeps freezing cold air in Antarctica and kind of keeps the air from the outside world from getting in. That's one of the reasons that the South Pole is so much colder than the North Pole. But one of the other effects that that has is it means that pollutants from the rest of the industrialized world get to the South Pole last. So if pollutants and greenhouse gases have made it to the South Pole, and this observatory here can detect them, then you know that it's worldwide. So this is an extremely sensitive instrument. So you actually had to go through a training course to go up here on this roof. And one of the things that they told you is that you're not allowed to burp, otherwise it might affect global warming data. So recently there was some data, there was some national news that came out of this, this instrument here where they determined that carbon levels passed 400 ppm, which is the highest level that it's ever been in millennia. and it was detected above that level at the South Pole Station for the first time a year ago. So this here is the Ice Cube Neutrino Observatory. So this is the most expensive observatory, piece of equipment, or really anything at the South Pole, or for that matters in all of Antarctica. It costs $500 million, and it also studies something that's very obscure and very, very interesting. So it studies neutrinos. Neutrinos are tiny, tiny invisible particles that are very, very hard to detect with any sort of classical detector. So you can't detect a neutrino because it's neutral. It doesn't interact with matter. It doesn't really interact with other energy. So they built this detector, and underneath that building that you see there, it's called Ice Cube because there is a full square kilometer in the ice of over 3,000 of these. This is a sensor that's buried under the ice. All of them are connected to that building on the top that's able to sense tiny, tiny flashes of light that occasionally happen when you have a neutrino that does interact with something. And because they have so many of these detectors, and you can see them all here with those little flashes are detecting a potential neutrino event, they are able to detect the traces, the paths that neutrinos are taking. They're also able to, filter out all of the noise and determine which of these are, interesting neutrinos versus non-interesting neutrinos. Now, what they consider an interesting neutrino is an intergalactic cosmic neutrino. That's a neutrino that was emitted by an extremely, extremely powerful event in space, extremely, extremely far away. And the reason that these are interesting is because when you have a supernova or two galaxies colliding, they release a lot of visible light. They also release a lot of energy, including neutrinos. Visible light is affected by gravity. It's affected by dark matter. It's affected by clouds of gas. So if you have gravity, it might curve the light, which means that when it reaches us, we don't know where it really came from. There might be nebulae or clouds of gas that block it from reaching us altogether. But neutrinos are affected by none of these things. So that means that if the Ice Cube detector can detect a steady stream of cosmic neutrinos coming from a single area, they know with much more certainty that the event, whatever that event may be, the high energy event that caused those neutrinos came from that area in space. So this over here is actually two experiments. This is the South Pole Telescope and the Bicep Keck Array. So these are also two radio telescopes that are searching for the earliest traces of the cosmic background radiation. So these aren't visible light telescopes. There actually are no visible light telescopes at the South Pole that are actually taking pictures. There are some small ones, but no major ones like this. What they're looking for is they're looking for cosmic microwave background radiation, and they're looking for certain patterns. They're looking right now for a specific kind of pattern that's called a B mode that can give them some hints on what happened in the earliest stages of the universe, microseconds after the Big Bang. So the science that they're doing here, has made amazing, amazing leaps and bounds. They just upgraded the Bicep Array this year. They're going to be completely rebuilding South Pole Telescope within a few years. And it's quite possible that the next major leap that we make in the understanding of physics, science, and astronomy come from the South Pole. So science isn't the only thing that happens in Antarctica. There's also tourism. Extreme tourism for extremely large amounts of money. So this is the tourist camp at the South Pole. So it's run by a company called ALE, Antarctic Logistics and Expeditions, and they are the only company that can take you to the South Pole. Now, who wants to guess how much 2 hours at the South Pole is going to run you? Yeah?
$25,000.
$25,000. Do I have another bid? Yeah.
100 grand.
What's that?
100 grand.
100 grand?
50K.
50K is exactly what it is. You got yourself a patch, sir. So 2 hours at the South Pole costs you $55,000. So what you do is you fly in on one of these little Twin Otter airplanes. You'll probably get a couple days in their glacier camp on the edge of Antarctica. You fly in to the South Pole. You get about an hour, taking selfies at the geographic South Pole, and then you get another hour taking a tour of the station that this year was given by yours truly. So another of the things that I was responsible for doing when I was down there was giving official tours of the public areas of the South Pole Station. So this over here is, when I had a group of people, I was explaining to them about how the telescopes and the science works. We would take them through the station, show them the pictures on the walls, talk about what it's like to live there. So we would have, a lot of really, really rich, sometimes really weird people. You'd have a lot of, like Chinese multimillionaires. You get some Russian oligarchs. There was this one guy from the U.S. I probably should have asked his name, but I forgot to. He was the founder of a tech company, and he was down there with 11 other people. And later, one of the tour guides told me that he had, and I was like, oh wow, he must be rich. He paid for himself and his son. He was like, oh no, he paid for everybody in that group. So the people who were down there, they had a lot of different reasons for being there, but they had a lot of money. Now, in addition to that, we also had some of my favorite people to give tours of the station, and that was the ultra athletes. So we had guys like this. He is a Swedish ultra athlete who skied in his ski wheelchair 800 miles from the edge of the Antarctic Plateau to the South Pole Station. Now, he did have a guide with him. He had a guy who was hauling the sled with the supplies. But this guy was incredible. I gave him a tour of the station. When we went up to the second floor, he walked up the stairs with his hands. I've never met anybody who blew my mind as much as this guy did. I also got to meet another Swedish person, interestingly enough, but it was a nurse. She was about this big. She was in her 30s, and she had just broken the women's speed record for solo ski traversing the Antarctic continent. Well, she was halfway there. She just broke the speed record for traversing from the edge of the continent to the South Pole, and then she went on to break the record from going to the South Pole all the way back to the other side. And she actually broke the record of the lady who operated this camp here, the head of the ALE agency, who had held that record previously and who also still holds the record for the most times traversed of the Antarctic continent of anybody ever. So these guys were really, really amazing people. I got to hang out with them a lot. I got to know them really well because I was the one who was, giving their clients the tours all the time. So it was really great sometimes to go hike over to their camp, have a coffee and just talk to them about their experiences doing this kind of stuff. So there was somebody else who we got to meet who came down on a tourist plane. Anybody know who this is? Anybody recognize? He's got a very distinctive face. This is Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon. So Buzz Aldrin showed up without really telling anybody he was coming on a tourist expedition. And we found out about an hour before he came in. And of course, we had VIPs who came to the station. John Kerry was supposed to come there. He didn't really come because his plane got stuck in McMurdo. None of us really wanted him there anyway because we were like, oh, he's just trying to come in and, use more taxpayer dollars. He's not coming down here to actually help science. We had Anthony Bourdain who came in and shot an episode of Parts Unknown. So I'm actually in it, so if anybody's an Anthony Bourdain fan, you'll see a nice close-up of me eating in the South Pole cafeteria. But this guy, okay, everybody who's at the South Pole, whether you're a scientist or you're just a science, guy or you're a geek, this guy is a hero to you. So, of course, everybody was ridiculously excited. We went, we got to meet him, we got to talk to him, we got to talk to him about his experiences. He got to talk about how he was really excited to come here because he's always been a proponent of going back to the moon and then going to Mars. And this is one of the places that NASA is using, as a model for, a potential future station. But, and this is me giving him, giving him a gift from the station. It's a little, it's a VIP CD that we would give with pictures and science stats and stuff to the VIPs who would come in. But unfortunately, as some of you guys might have heard, it was international news. He had a medical incident when he was at the South Pole. I'm not going to give, full details about it for privacy reasons, but he had issues acclimating to the South Pole, and we were able to, treat him and get him out on the next plane, which we also luckily had a plane scheduled that day. And he was able to recover, make a full recovery in New Zealand. But, you know, we were terrified that, you know, Buzz Aldrin would die in our watch. But, so I can say that I got to, you know, carry Buzz Aldrin down a set of stairs and help evacuate him from the South Pole, you know, which wasn't expected, but, you know, it was an amazing thing to get to meet him, an amazing thing to get to contribute to him getting out of there safely. He's also the oldest guy who's ever been to the South Pole. He's 86, which it probably wasn't such a good idea for him to come, but he's been known for, you know, being a risk taker. Going to the moon kind of takes that. So the tourist season at the South Pole only goes on for, you know, a very brief time, 2 months, because after that it gets too difficult to land planes. So I helped them pack up their stuff. You know, they cover it with tarps, leave, and then they come back next year. So next thing I'm going to talk about is culture in Antarctica. Antarctica does have a very distinct culture, and the culture at each different base, you know, is unique. And this culture is one of the most important things for keeping high morale when you are in, you know, such a remote, such a, you know, a difficult place to be in. It's similar to a lot of the folks who work there, you know, talking about working on remote army bases or, you know, working on ships in the Navy. You have a unique culture that develops. So we would have, you know, musical events. We would have open mic nights. We had 3 different bands that formed at the South Pole, and we had a really nice, well-stocked room full of musical instruments. We would have Thanksgiving and Christmas feasts that, again, the cooks would do an incredible, amazing job. You can see we have our little, you know, DVD of the fireplace going on. You can see we have cardboard covering the windows because this was 9 o'clock at night. But of course, you know, it's bright daylight out there 24/7. So we did that to kind of, you know, make it a little bit more holiday-y. We would actually get a 2-day weekend for Christmas, New Year's, and Thanksgiving. Generally at the South Pole Station, you're going to be working 9 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. This was our Thanksgiving meal. It was really good, comparable to Thanksgiving meals that I have at home. You know, and again, the cooks really just did outdo themselves and give us, you know, a little bit of a reason to forget, you know, all of the things that we can't do because we're at the South Pole. This was our Christmas meal, which was similar, also excellent. So another piece of important culture is the South Pole moving ceremony. And this happens on January 1st of every year. The South Pole drifts 30 meters each year due to the movement of the ice. The entire ice shelf is drifting. So it moves about 30 meters away from the station. So what they do is they bring in a surveyor who determines exactly where the geographic South Pole actually is. The previous winter rovers who spent the whole winter there have a competition among themselves, and then they build and design the South Pole marker. And then we have a ceremony where everybody in the base gets in a circle. We pass the South Pole, you know, from person to person around the circle. And then the incoming winter manager takes it and sticks it down for the next year. And this is the new South Pole marker that's still sitting there right now and is going to be there until January 1st, where the new marker that they designed is going to replace it. And this is the previous year's South Pole marker, sitting abandoned and lonely where the South Pole used to be. And you know, as you can see, I like the design of the old one better. And it's all based on, you know, the skill set of the people who you just happen to have in that station. You know, you have a guy who either knows, you know, metal fabrication, who can make something really cool like this, or you have somebody who literally learns it while they're there to make something like this. So, sports and recreation. When you're in Antarctica, there is a lot of downtime. You know, if you're a scientist, you're going to set up your stuff and then you have to wait until results come in. When you are a carpenter, you know, you have to build something and then you have to sit around until the next thing needs to be built. When you're any of those people, you really can't do what you're supposed to do because the plane that was supposed to bring the stuff you need to do it has gotten delayed for the last 2 weeks. So people come up with their own way, you know, to make time go by. So some people, you know, would read and study. Some people, would drink and play pool and hang out. Some people, would go and take advantage of the fact that you're at the South Pole and go outside, ski, run. So every week we would have multiple, sporting events. We would have an entire volleyball game. We had a full basketball court, and everybody at McMurdo, was jealous of the rec facilities we had. And again, the reason that they invested in building something like this is because this is what allows people to spend a full year down there without going crazy. Although people still do crack. So this was our traditional Wednesday night volleyball. That's me up in the middle there, getting my spike on. The Race Around the World is an event that they do on Christmas Day every single year, where they have a 2-mile race around the geographic South Pole. So you're literally racing around the world. And some people treat it as like an actual running race, and then other people carry on the tradition and you race around the world with every single possible method that you could think of. Some people dress up as penguins. These guys over here, some of the science techs, took some couches from the lounge, hauled them out, attached them to the back of a snowmobile, and then drove around drinking beer and yelling at us to go faster. Some guys skied it. One guy drove a backhoe. So it's a lot of fun. And then there's also the South Pole Marathon. So this is something that I knew I wanted to do when I go down there. I own a company called Marathon Studios, and I wanted to run a damn marathon in Antarctica. So the moment I got there, I started training. I would go running outside every day. I would run on the skiway that the planes would land on. I almost got run over once by an unscheduled tourist plane that then got an official complaint from the Antarctic Program because they didn't announce they were landing. Running outside at the South Pole is tough. It's negative 30 degrees. You're running on snow, so it's like running on sand. And of course, you're running out, you're running wearing jackets, so you get hot. And then your face sweats, and then it all freezes. Your eyelashes would freeze, and every once in a while, you'd have to take your gloves off and wipe it off. Otherwise, you couldn't open your eyes because they'd freeze shut. So we had 12 people who started the South Pole Marathon. 6 of us finished it. I was one of those who was able to finish it. I did it in 4.5 hours, which was pretty close to the best time that they've had. But the reason that I was able to do that is because we were amazingly lucky with weather. It was a balmy 15 degrees below zero, no wind, and the wind is what kills you. The guys who ran the marathon before were talking about how it was so windy that they had to wear plastic aprons to keep all the ice from building up on their jackets. So this was me right after I finished the marathon and right before I fell down on the ground, just laid there for 10 minutes. Are you okay? Yeah, I'm just going to lay here for a little while. But it was an amazing opportunity, and I'd do it again. You get so well trained from running in the altitude, but by the time I came down, running in New Zealand it was a cakewalk. Of course, it didn't last. I wish it did, but. So you can also go skiing. So this is something that I wanted to do because it's one of the most traditional South Pole things you can do. So I would go out and I would ski around, and this also gave me the opportunity to really get out into Antarctica. So I would go out just far enough that the station was a tiny little black speck on the horizon. Of course, I'd make sure that I checked the weather because if it whites out, there's no way you're getting back. But this is me looking back at my tracks. Completely nothing. This is the most featureless area in the world. It's like in a video game. When you go past the edge of the map, it just fades off to white. So this is me after a 7-hour ski trip. So on the anniversary, the 105th anniversary of Scott reaching the South Pole with his men on January 14th, 1912, I decided to go out. I read his diary. I found out how many miles he skied the last day. So I went and I skied that same distance, ending at the South Pole, to kind of get an idea of of what it is that he went through. It's so cold out there that when I took my phone out to take a panorama, you can see, how it's starting to glitch there, and then after that, the phone just died. The Wi-Fi still doesn't work on my phone because for some reason it's not built to work in those kind of temperatures. Who would have thunk it? So this is the holiday or the Super Bowl party that we had right before I left. Of course, we didn't get the Super Bowl until 2 days later, so it had already been spoiled for me by somebody on Facebook. But everybody was like, "Don't tell me who won. I'll kill you if you tell me who won." This is having, we had a party that the carpenters threw. We were playing Jenga outside. And now this is one of the, most interesting and weirdest South Pole traditions. It's called the 300 Club. Now, I didn't do a full 300 Club. The 300 Club is over the winter, when the temperature first dips below 100 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Everybody in the station who's crazy enough goes into the sauna, strips down, waits until it's 200 degrees inside, wait until they can't bear it anymore, then they run outside, open the door, and run out naked around the South Pole, and then run back inside before they can freeze and die. So now, I didn't do a full 300 Club because A, it wasn't winter, B, it wasn't 200 or 100 degrees below 0. So I actually did like a 250 Club, and C, I wasn't naked, but I got as close to it as I could. It actually wasn't that bad. So all things must come to an end. So, after 4.5 months in February, it was time to fly north for the winter. So everybody was prepping the station for the winter. All the fuel was loaded in. They took all the vehicles, put them up on blocks so they don't get buried, winterized them. Of course, multiple times, my flights to South Pole or to McMurdo got canceled, got put off for I think a week, and that was the bag drag. I pulled all my stuff, cleaned out my room, and went to get it loaded on the plane. Yes, I'm wearing shorts because at that point, I was like, oh, it's only 30 degrees below 0 and I only have to go out for 5 minutes. I don't care. This was my ride coming to take us out from the South Pole. Everybody loaded in, and we took off. So flying over Antarctica, this was, I got a much better view going out than going in because I got a window seat. And, I got to see just how big this continent is. It's huge. The mountains that are underneath us have never been named. Nobody's ever been there. It might be 100 years before anybody ever sets foot down in there. And it's not because nobody's telling you can't go. It's just because it's so far away. It's so remote. So after a 6-hour flight back to McMurdo, we landed. I was hoping I was going to have another, a couple days in McMurdo to hang out, but they told us, nope, 3 hours later, you're coming back to the airfield and you're taking off on a C-130 for New Zealand. So this was like 4 in the morning. You can see the ice had melted and it's slowly going to start freezing again because it's getting into winter. That's a last picture of McMurdo as I went out and went in the last walk around. You can see some seals out in the distance. And then, we got in our C-130, took off. We had all hoped that we wouldn't be in a C-130 because it's going to take you 13 hours to get from McMurdo to New Zealand, a lot slower than one of the big jets. But I remember, the first time that I saw going from the frozen barren wasteland to seeing, the first green, the first, dirt that I'd seen in 4.5 months. And then all of a sudden, we landed at Christchurch Airport. We had to go through customs, which was kind of funny. Technically, you've never left New Zealand because you didn't actually go to another country. So you have to get like a special visa that extends your stay in New Zealand, even though you're not really there. So then there's us, looking like this. Everybody's got facial hair and is all scruffy and dirty, wearing her big reds, walking through the international airport with, people with their kids going on vacation, looking around like, where the hell did those guys come from? So we all turned in our ECW, cleaned up, went out, and then that was it. I went off into, New Zealand, and it was weird. The music that I heard on the radio, I had no idea where it came from, because I hadn't heard any music. The only news that I got, was from reading, the New York Times condensed edition that they would send up. all this stuff had happened, and I had no idea. So, it took a little while. I think it took longer to adapt back to real life than it took to adapt, to life at the South Pole. When I left, I didn't want to go. I enjoyed it there a lot. But then again, I also didn't want to stay for the whole winter. Not yet. I wasn't ready for that. So the last guys, the last guys who flew in with me on the first plane just left 2 days ago. And they were ready to leave. They wanted out of there. So wintering over, spending a full year there, seeing the auroras, being in the most isolated place on Earth is something that I think someday I want to do that. Someday I'll go back. But for now, that was my experience. So they sent me a medal. You get a medal for going to Antarctica. And of course, I smuggled a rock out, so I now have a rock from every continent. And I have these pictures, and I have these memories, and I have the hope that one day I'm going to go back and experience more of this. So, thank you, everybody. So, I'm happy to answer a couple questions. Anybody got any questions? Yeah.
What are the vehicles used? I know you mentioned the airplanes, but what are the vehicles used down there for fuel?
So a lot of them also use the modified JP8 with jet fuel. Some of them also use diesel, but they're all modified to work at the cold. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, with the winds that you were talking about that blow the snow inward, does all the winds just blow straight inward and then like on the outer regions, does it actually go down? Because you said there was low precipitation, so does it go up everywhere or does it actually
So at the South Pole, catabolic winds, excuse me, they always blow from really the same direction. And I can't say it's from north, because every direction is north, but they blow from what we call grid 60 north, which is why the station actually points into the winds, and it's built like an aerofoil, so the wind can be used to, to scour as much snow out as possible. But the polar plateau is much, much windier than the other areas of Antarctica.
What are like rules that about developing Antarctica? Because apparently, like ALE, is that the company you said that can
ALE.
bring people down and stuff?
So Antarctica, is considered a possession of all mankind. It's jointly administered by all the countries that have operations there. When you're on a base in Antarctica, you're considered to be on territory that's under the jurisdiction of the country you came from. And the Antarctic Treaty states that Antarctica can never be used for purposes other than scientific exploration and limited tourism. So the tourism, all of the operators who operate there have all agreed to, abide by these agreements. There's, organizations that they use to kind of limit, the impact that they can have in the environment. Antarctica can never be used for, drilling for oil, for, mining, for military purposes. It's meant to be used as, something for all of humanity to be able to experience from a scientific perspective. Yeah.
I'm just curious about the sounds of Antarctica, not the man-made sounds, but especially when you were skiing, or just the sound of your skis, or
Crunch, crunch,
crunch,
crunch,
the snow's
crunch.
so dry.
And then when you stop, nothing. There's absolutely nothing. Just the wind, the snow. That's it. The South Pole is empty. It's a dead place. Nothing has ever been alive there. Nothing ever will be alive there except humans. Even if the worst predictions of global warming come true, because of the katabatic winds, because of the unique climatology of Antarctica, the South Pole will always be frozen. Yes?
You said that when you're on the South Pole, you're in all the time zones. So is there like an agreed time zone that they use there?
Yes. So all American bases, well, at least McMurdo and South Pole operate on New Zealand time. That's because our home base operates out of New Zealand. So it's just a time zone of convenience, so that the New Zealand guys are awake at the same time as we are. We can talk with them. The plane scheduling makes sense. But that's completely arbitrary because you are in every single time zone. When New Year's happened, we had some guys who would walk around the South Pole and try to celebrate as many New Year's celebrations as they could. One of them, I think, got to 16 before they fell asleep, because it takes, I think, 25 hours with, you know, the way time zones work for every time zone to experience the New Year. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you think you'd be able to live in like a desert as you lived in Antarctica?
So the only reason, you know, that we were able to survive where we were is because of the, you know, incredible logistics system that's been arranged. You know, nobody has ever just gone and lived in Antarctica. You can't. You know, it's like a desert. Yeah, you can drive there. You can bring stuff. Antarctica, you can't get there. You know, you can't sail a ship there. You'll get sunk by the ice. You can't sail a plane there unless you have a giant, you know, plane. And then when you get there, how are you going to refuel? You know, there's no airports that are going to sell you jet fuel. So, you know, it's because of international cooperation that Antarctic bases can survive. You know, we had the Australians visit us. You know, we refueled their planes. We had the Chinese Antarctic Survey. The Russians drop by every so often. But you know, right now, unless you have the resources of a government or a giant company, or you're a billionaire like Elon Musk, I guess he could go live in Antarctica if he wanted to. You know, it's just too remote. That's one of the reasons that Antarctica is such a mysterious place. That I love, you know, the people who have you know, conspiracy theories about Antarctica. You hear about people saying, oh, there are Nazis down there. There are aliens down there. The entrance to Hollow Earth is down there. Notice that conspiracy theories are all about places that, you know, nobody can really go to disprove you. The difference is the South Pole, people can go there to disprove you. So whenever I would see like one of those, you know, things pop up on the news, I would just go comment it, be like, hey, here's a picture of me. I'm at the South Pole right now. You know, I can prove it. So, Mr. Conspiracy Theorist, only one of these two things is true. Either everything that you just talked about is bullshit, or I'm in on it and I'm lying to you. Pick one. So I enjoyed being able to do that. Anybody else? Okay, thank you everybody for coming. If you want a patch, come see me, and if you want to try on the Big Red, you're welcome to.